There was a contract on the table worth $25 million. The room was full. Nike executives in tailored suits, attorneys with folders thick enough to double as doorstops, journalists who had covered sports for decades and thought they had seen every variation of every moment this industry could produce. Cameras positioned at every angle, a gold-stitched jersey hanging backstage waiting for its close-up. Everything had been mapped out to the minute. The highlight reel would play first, 3 minutes of carefully edited footage designed to remind the room exactly who Caitlin Clark was and exactly why this number made sense. Then she would walk to center stage, accept the jersey, hold it up with both hands, smile, say something gracious, something polished, something the PR team had already reviewed twice. Let the flash bulbs do their thing, shake some hands, take the photos, walk out. That was the evening. That was the deal. Clean, efficient, historic, and entirely under control. Caitlin Clark had other plans. What happened instead, in a single unrehearsed moment, in front of every camera and every executive and every person in that room who thought they already knew how this night was going to end, would send shockwaves through professional sports in a way that no press release, no ad campaign, and no marketing strategy ever could have manufactured. By the time that room emptied out, the conversation around women's basketball in this country had fundamentally shifted. Not slightly adjusted, not nudged in a new direction, shifted, hard, permanently. But to understand why that moment hit the way it did, you first need to understand the world Caitlin Clark walked into, because if you skip that part, the Nike event is just a nice story, and this is not just a nice story. Here is something that does not get talked about nearly enough, and when you hear it, it is going to sit with you differently than you expect. For most of the WNBA's existence, the women competing at the absolute highest level of professional basketball in the United States were not making enough money from basketball to live on basketball alone. Not comfortably, not lavishly, not even adequately in most cases. We're talking about elite athletes, women who had dedicated their entire lives to the sport, who had gone through college programs, survived brutal NCAA tournaments, earned their spots in a professional league through years of sacrifice, injury, and relentless work. And the financial reality waiting for them on the other side of all of that was, to put it plainly, embarrassing. For many years, the average WNBA salary hovered somewhere in the mid-five-figure range. The maximum a top player could earn from her actual basketball contract, the contract for the sport she had dedicated her life to, was somewhere around $250,000 per year. And for the vast majority of players in the league, the number was nowhere near that ceiling. Now, $250,000 sounds like real money, and in isolation, it is. But professional sports does not exist in isolation. It exists in comparison. And the comparison here is what makes the jaw drop. The minimum rookie contract in the NBA during the same era was over $1 million per year. A player who had never appeared in a single professional game yet, a player who had not proven a single thing at the highest level, was contractually guaranteed more than 4 times what the best players in the women's league were earning at their peak. That gap is not just a number. That gap has consequences. Those consequences looked like this. WNBA players, after their seasons ended, boarded international flights. Not for vacations, not for press tours. They flew to Europe, to Australia, to Turkey, to Russia, to China, to wherever a league was willing to pay them what their talent actually deserved, which meant leaving their homes, their families, and their lives behind for months at a stretch just to make the finances work. Angel Reese, one of the most recognizable young faces in the entire sport, stated publicly that her WNBA paycheck was not enough to cover her rent. Let that land. A professional athlete competing at the pinnacle of her sport in America could not pay rent with her professional salary. She had to go overseas to close that gap. Endorsement deals back home were essentially non-existent for most players. Sneaker contracts were a myth for nearly everyone. You could count the number of WNBA players who had ever received a signature shoe on one hand and still have fingers left over. Cheryl Swoops in 1995 was the first. Elena Delle Donne came after. Maya Moore, Candace Parker, Sabrina Ionescu in 2023. That's the entire list across a league that had been operating since 1997. 26 years, one league, a handful of signature shoes. The most recognizable players in women's professional basketball were wearing shoes made for someone else, branded with someone else's name, while the companies selling those shoes were pulling in massive profit margins and writing checks to the men across the hall that made the women's numbers look like accounting errors. This was not a secret, it was simply accepted. It was the financial architecture of the sport, and for a very long time, it appeared to be permanent. Then the spring of 2024 arrived, and with it, a rookie from Iowa who had absolutely no intention of accepting any of it. Before Caitlin Clark had taken a single shot in a WNBA game, before she had run a single play in Indiana Fever colors, before she had been fouled, benched, praised, criticized, or photographed in a professional uniform, Nike was already at the table.
The figure that circulated most widely in the reporting was $25 million. Some accounts put it slightly higher, closer to $28 million across 8 years, but even the more conservative number was so far outside the previous record for a WNBA endorsement deal that the comparison barely made sense. Sabrina Ionescu's multi-year arrangement with Nike had been the largest deal of its kind in league history. It was reported as a 7-figure total. That was the record. That was the ceiling. Caitlin's deal did not nudge past that ceiling. It did not chip away at it. It removed it entirely and built a new structure in its place. NBA veterans, players who had been in the league for years, players with championship rings and all-star appearances on their resumes, were reportedly pausing to reconsider their own endorsement valuations when the number became public. A 22-year-old rookie in the WNBA had just outpaced them in the endorsement market. The obvious question is why? And the answer is not charity, and it is not sentiment, and it is absolutely not because Nike decided to do something generous for women's sports out of the goodness of their corporate heart. Nike does not operate on goodness. Nike operates on data. And the data on Caitlin Clark was unlike anything the company had seen in the women's sports market. Start with the 2024 WNBA draft. The year Caitlin was selected first overall by the Indiana Fever, 2.45 million people watched the draft broadcast. The previous record for draft viewership was approximately 600,000. She did not break the record, she obliterated it and then nearly quadrupled it before she had done anything in the professional game at all. Then look at the ticket sales. Indiana Fever season ticket revenue increased by over 1,000% between the moment she entered the draft and the start of the season. Road games in cities where the local WNBA franchise had never sold out a single game in franchise history were suddenly selling out weeks in advance. The visiting team's games sold out because Caitlin Clark was on the opposing bench. Look at the television numbers. When her name appeared on the broadcast schedule, ratings did not tick upward modestly, they doubled, sometimes tripled. Stadiums that had echoed with emptiness for years were suddenly turning people away at the door. Look at the merchandise. Her jersey was selling faster than the league could restock it. The supply chain could not keep up with the demand. Items bearing her number were perpetually backordered in a league where merchandise movement had historically been an afterthought. And look at the demographic shift. Caitlin was pulling in an entirely new audience, young women, teenage girls, families who had never watched a WNBA game in their lives and were now showing up in arenas and in front of televisions because of her. She was not just growing the existing fan base, she was building a new one from scratch, live in real time. Nike was not betting on a basketball player. Nike was betting on a structural change in the sports market. They were betting that this woman was not a trend, not a moment, not a temporary spike in the algorithm. They were betting she was a permanent shift in the landscape. And they were right. So the contract was prepared. The number was agreed upon, the event was planned, and everything was set up for the cleanest, most controlled rollout of a signature shoe deal in women's basketball history. Except for one thing nobody had accounted for. Nike has done this before, many times. A signing event for a signature athlete is one of the most rehearsed rituals in sports marketing. There is a formula, there is a sequence, there is a production timeline broken down into segments precise enough that the people backstage know exactly how many seconds each phase is supposed to take. For this event, the formula was already in motion before the guests arrived. The guest list had been printed and confirmed. The venue had been dressed. The ceremonial jersey, gold stitching, Indiana fever colors, her number displayed prominently across the back, was hanging backstage in a garment bag. The highlight film had been edited, scored, reviewed, and approved. The talking points for the speech portion had been typed on cards and placed where they needed to be. Camera positions had been locked. The social media team already had drafted post copies sitting in a queue, ready to go live the moment the jersey was raised. The plan was airtight. Step 1, highlight film. Step 2, jersey presentation on stage. Step 3, polished remarks. Step 4, photos. Step 5, everyone goes home having witnessed history in the most orderly, well-documented way possible. For the 48 hours following the event, the internet would buzz. Pre-orders for the shoe would flood in. The machine would take over from there. Caitlin arrived at the venue with the composure she always carries. She has a quality that veteran players sometimes take years to develop, an ability to exist inside a high-pressure environment without being consumed by it. At 22, she walked into rooms full of cameras and executives the way most people walk into their own kitchen, present, settled, ready. Sophie Cunningham was with her. Sophie had been told, as far as anyone in that room understood, that she was there as a teammate, a friendly face in the crowd. She might appear in the background of a few photos. She might get a mention during the speech, a kind word, a toast, the kind of acknowledgement that teammates offer each other at moments like this. Beyond that, she had no role in the evening's program. She was there to support her friend. She had absolutely no idea what was about to happen to her life. The lights in the venue went down. The conversations in the room dropped to a murmur and then to silence. On the large screen behind the stage, the highlight film began to play. It started in Des Moines, Iowa. High school gymnasiums, half-filled but electric. A teenager draining contested three-pointers from distances that most college players would not attempt, while local camera operators scrambled to keep up. From there, it moved through Iowa. The rewritten record books, the packed arenas, the all-time college basketball scoring record falling with such finality that it may never be approached again. Then the transition to the professional game, the draft, the fever.
The beginning of the hardest year of her basketball life. What the film did not do was sanitize any of it. The hard fouls were in there, the whistles that never came, the elbows, the screens thrown with extra intent, the physical targeting that was impossible to ignore and yet somehow continued to go largely unaddressed by officials throughout the season. The pundits who called her overexposed, the online critics who argued she had not earned the attention she was receiving, the bone-deep exhaustion of a 22-year-old carrying the entire viewership of a league on her back while simultaneously trying to figure out where she fit in a professional system that was still adjusting to her presence. But the film also showed the other side. The sold-out crowds surrounding city blocks, the arenas trembling after buzzer beaters, the little girls in the stands with her number on their jerseys, wide-eyed, watching something that looked to them like a real-life superhero. The cultural moment crystallizing in real time, as a league that had quietly struggled for relevance for decades suddenly found itself at the center of the national sports conversation. As the screen darkened and the film ended, the audience leaned forward. Phones appeared. This was the moment. This was what everyone had come for. A Nike executive walked to the stage carrying the ceremonial jersey. The flash bulbs were ready. The plan was in its final seconds of execution.
Caitlin accepted the jersey. She held it. She looked at it. For just a beat longer than the script called for, she stared at that jersey in her hands. Then she turned away from the executive. She turned away from the cameras. She turned away from the photographers and the journalists and the social media team with their fingers hovering over the post button. She turned to face Sophie Cunningham. The room did not react immediately. It froze. Not because people were confused about what they were seeing, but because the human brain sometimes needs an extra second to process something it was not prepared to encounter. What was playing out in front of every person in that venue was simply not in any version of any script that any of them had been handed. Caitlin's voice was steady, not performed, not rehearsed, not the kind of steady that comes from running lines in a mirror the night before, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what you are about to say and exactly why you are saying it. "This is not just for me," she said. "This is for all the women who show up, put up a strong fight, and defend their team." No applause, no cheering, no camera flashes going off in rapid succession, just silence. And then, from backstage, a sleek black display case rolled onto the stage. The audience was still trying to process the turn away from the cameras. The case moved into position, and Caitlin reached inside and removed a custom shoebox. She did not hold it up. She did not angle it toward any camera. She did not pause for documentation of any kind. She walked it directly to Sophie Cunningham and placed it in her hands. Sophie smiled. The smile of someone who assumes she is receiving a thoughtful teammate gift, a signed pair of shoes, a commemorative sneaker in fever colors, the kind of gesture that is genuinely touching and would be talked about within the team for years. She opened the box. Inside, a pair of specially designed player-only sneakers, Indiana fever colors, hand-stitched detailing, and across the side of each shoe, a phrase that anyone who had followed Sophie Cunningham's career would recognize immediately as the defining phrase of her entire identity as a competitor: never give up. Sophie ran her fingers over the stitching. She looked at the shoes, and then she noticed something else beneath the tissue paper. A folded document. She picked it up and opened it. It was a contract. Not Caitlin's contract, Sophie's contract. A complete, negotiated, legally executed endorsement agreement with Nike, arranged by Caitlin Clark as a condition of her own deal. Here is the part that needs to be heard clearly. Caitlin Clark sat across the table from Nike executives during the negotiations for the largest endorsement deal in women's basketball history and told them directly that she would not sign her contract until her teammate had a contract of her own. She used $25 million worth of leverage that every agent, every financial advisor, and every industry standard that had ever existed in professional sports said belonged exclusively to her, and she split it. She did not donate money. She did not give Sophie a generous gift. She used the negotiating power of her own historic deal to secure a separate, independent business arrangement for a teammate who otherwise would never have been in that room at all. Sophie stood there for 30 seconds without saying a word. 30 full seconds, according to people who were present. The box in one hand, the contract in the other, trying to locate her equilibrium in a moment that had completely dismantled it. When the room finally understood what had happened, the silence broke. The applause that followed was not the polished business event kind. It was the other kind. The kind where you are clapping because something just happened in front of you that you know you are going to be describing to people for the rest of your life, and you're not entirely sure any description is ever going to do it justice.
If you are sitting there right now wondering why it was Sophie Cunningham, out of every player in the Indiana Fever roster, out of every woman in that league, then you have not been paying close enough attention to what happened during Caitlin Clark's first professional season. Because Sophie Cunningham is the reason that first season did not break her. That is not dramatic language. That is not a narrative device. That is a factual description of what occurred on WNBA floors throughout the 2024 season. From the very first game, Caitlin Clark had a target on her back. And not the kind that comes with being talented or being drafted first overall, the specific, concentrated kind that comes when you are too visible, too successful, and too disruptive to a culture that was not ready for you. Other players hit her harder than the rules allowed, checked her hands constantly, threw screens with intent that went well beyond competition. The physical contacts she absorbed on a nightly basis was operating at a level above what the rulebook permitted and well above what the officials were choosing to address. The Kennedy Carter incident became national news, but that was just the most visible example of something that was happening consistently, deliberately, and largely without consequence throughout the season. Sophie Cunningham stepped into that space, not with words, not with social media posts or press conference statements, with her body. She put herself between Caitlin and whatever was coming at her. She threw herself into physical fouls that sent messages no verbal response could have sent. She confronted players who came at her teammate with the kind of energy that made opposing players reconsider whether the exchange was worth it. She committed a deliberate foul late in the season that was seen across the country. Afterward, a reporter asked her about it. She did not apologize. She did not qualify it. She said she would do it again. Every person watching knew she meant exactly that. None of this generated highlight packages. None of it showed up on a stat sheet. There was no endorsement value in it, no social media virality, no personal brand benefit of any kind. She was doing the unglamorous, unacknowledged, structurally invisible work that protects a teammate without asking for anything in return. Caitlin saw it. Every single time it happened, she saw it. She did not say much about it publicly during the season. That is not who she is. She processes differently. She watches, she remembers, and she plans. The Nike moment was the plan. After a tough defeat, in a quiet moment on a team bus, she was already building it. During late-night practice sessions when it was just the two of them running pick-and-roll combinations after everyone else had gone home, she was already building it. The deal was not sprung on Nike as a surprise demand in the final hour. It was something she had been thinking about for months, shaped by months of watching Sophie show up for her in ways that the sport does not reward and that the cameras do not typically find. "People talk about the plays that she makes," Caitlin said at the event, with no teleprompter and no notes in front of her, "but Sophie makes the plays that nobody sees." That is not a line someone wrote for her. That is someone telling the truth about a person they have been watching carefully for a very long time. After that evening ended and the footage began circulating, Nike faced a decision that no marketing strategy document had prepared them for. Option 1, treat the Sophie moment as an extraordinary sidebar, a feel-good human interest story that would generate positive coverage for 48 to 72 hours before the news cycle moved on. Keep the campaign centered on Caitlin individually, one athlete, one signature shoe, one rollout. The original plan, more or less, intact. Option 2, understand what had just fallen into their hands and treat it accordingly. Nike's marketing team had been watching the women's sports market evolve in real time. The 2023 NCAA Women's Basketball Championship between Iowa and LSU drew 9.9 million viewers, the most watched women's college basketball game in American history. Analysts attributed a significant portion of that audience directly to Caitlin Clark's presence in the matchup. WNBA season ticket sales had increased by over 1,000% between her draft announcement and the start of her first professional season. Road games across the league were selling out in cities with no prior history of sellout attendance. The sport was undergoing a structural transformation that nobody in a boardroom had been able to predict or manufacture. And now, in the middle of all of that, an unrehearsed moment on a stage in Indianapolis had handed Nike something that no advertising budget on the planet could have created from scratch. A real story. Not a concept, not a brand narrative developed over months of focus groups and creative sessions, an actual, documented, emotionally authentic story about two women, one of whom had just been handed the largest endorsement deal in her sports history and immediately used it to pull her teammate up beside her. Nike chose option 2 completely and without hesitation. Within days, the entire campaign framework was rebuilt around what had happened in that room. The solo launch concept was set aside, the singular athlete against the world narrative that had anchored Nike's major campaigns for decades, the Jordan era, the Kobe era, the Serena era, all of it built on individual dominance and the mythology of one person conquering opposition alone, was not the story here. This was different. This was two people. This was a partnership built in practice gyms and on team buses and through hard fouls taken on behalf of a friend. And Nike was smart enough to recognize that selling that story was both more interesting and more true than anything their creative team could have constructed independently.
For the first time in the history of the brand's major signature campaigns, the central theme was not individual greatness. It was something harder to find and far more valuable. Genuine loyalty between two people in a world that does not typically reward it. The ads essentially wrote themselves. Nike's teams pulled real footage, pre-game warm-ups where Sophie positioned herself between Caitlin and hostile crowds in visiting arenas. The two of them staying late in an empty gym, running plays until the facility staff needed to lock up. Quiet bus rides after difficult losses where they sat together without needing to say anything. The moments that team cameras happen to catch and that almost never make it into the broadcast. Co-branded merchandise went online. Within hours of going live, it had sold out. The response was not just commercial, it was cultural. The conversation that followed was not primarily about sneakers or endorsement figures or market valuations. It was about what Caitlin Clark had chosen to do when she had every right to choose something else entirely, and what that choice revealed about who she was beyond the statistics and the highlights and the records. To fully grasp the weight of what happened that evening, you need to understand what professional sports actually runs on. Leverage is the currency. Leverage is the thing that everyone in professional athletics is taught from the earliest stages of their career to maximize in their own direction. Your agent exists to extract the maximum value from your leverage. Your financial advisors exist to ensure that value flows to you. The entire architecture of the industry, every contract structure, every endorsement negotiation, every business decision made on behalf of a professional athlete is built on the assumption that leverage serves the individual who holds it. There is nothing cynical about that observation. It is simply how the machine operates. It has operated that way for as long as professional sports has existed as a business enterprise. The unwritten code is clear. When you have leverage, you use it for yourself. You make your number bigger. You secure your future. You take care of your own. Caitlin Clark had leverage that women in her sport had never come close to possessing before. She had the kind of leverage that changes careers, changes contracts, and changes entire market structures. She had leverage that the most powerful agents in the sport had never held on behalf of a women's basketball player. And she looked at all of that leverage, at everything it could have secured exclusively for her, and she made a different calculation. She decided that leverage was most valuable when you used it to create access for someone who did not have any. There is no precedent in the documented history of major professional sports endorsement deals. There are athletes who have donated portions of their earnings. There are athletes who have created foundations and funded charitable initiatives with their wealth. Those are meaningful acts, but what Caitlin did was architecturally different. She did not give Sophie money. She did not write her a check. She sat across the negotiating table from the most powerful sportswear company in the world and said that her signature on their contract was contingent on Sophie's name appearing on a separate contract of her own. She made Sophie's deal a condition of her own deal. She used the structural mechanics of a business negotiation, the very mechanics that had always been pointed inward towards self-interest, and redirected them outward. She did not wait until after the ink was dry to be generous. She built the generosity into the architecture of the agreement itself. That is not sentiment, that is strategy. It requires a specific kind of intelligence to understand that you have something no one else has at that particular moment, that the moment will not last indefinitely, and that the most meaningful thing you can do with it is create access for someone who would otherwise never get that seat at the table. And it requires a specific kind of character to actually do it. The story did not end when the room emptied out that evening in Indianapolis. It was just beginning. In the days following the Nike event, the clip circulated everywhere, not as sports content, not as endorsement deal news, as something that people were sending to each other because it made them feel something that sports does not usually make them feel, which is the sense that what they are watching reveals something genuinely admirable about a person. Caitlin Clark had been one of the most talked about athletes in America for over a year by that point. The discourse around her had become complicated and loud. Fierce supporters on one side, vocal critics on the other, endless debate about hype versus substance, about race and attention, and whether she was receiving opportunities that other players deserved, about what her presence meant for the league and for women's sports more broadly. The Nike moment did something interesting to all of that noise. It did not silence it, but it reframed it. Because whatever your position on any of the surrounding debate, the thing that happened on that stage was undeniable and unambiguous. A person who had every right to take something entirely for herself chose not to. She chose to share the most valuable thing she had, not money, not a platform, not kind words, but actual professional opportunity with the teammate who had protected her when protecting her cost everything and paid nothing.
The conversation that followed started going in a direction that sports media rarely navigates comfortably. What does it actually mean to use influence well? Not in a foundation and philanthropy way, not in a press conference announcing a donation way, but in the actual, operational, daily decisions a person makes when they sit at a table where power is being distributed. Sophie Cunningham had spent an entire professional career being exactly who she was, a fierce, physical, deeply loyal competitor who did the work that nobody photographs without any of the commercial infrastructure that athletes need to turn their professional existence into financial sustainability. She had protected her teammate at the cost of her own visibility, thrown her body into situations that generated negative attention without generating positive outcomes for her brand, and done all of it without a single endorsement arrangement that reflected the value of what she was contributing. Caitlin Clark looked at that and decided it was wrong, and then she did something about it. That is a rarer thing in professional athletics than any highlight reel or scoring record. Records can be broken, highlights fade. The kind of decision Caitlin made in that room, with full knowledge of what she was giving up, with full understanding of what she could have had and chose to redirect, that kind of decision becomes part of the story of a career in a way that statistics cannot touch. There is a version of this story that ends with the sellout merchandise numbers and the restructured Nike campaign and the mutual benefit that both athletes eventually derived from the partnership. That version is true. It happened. The business outcomes were real. But that version misses what actually matters. What actually matters is that this happened in a league that spent most of its existence asking its best players to earn their right to exist as professionals on terms that were, by any reasonable standard, exploitative. A league where the financial reality was so disconnected from the talent on display that its own stars had to leave the country every offseason just to keep the lights on. A league where a handful of signature shoes across 3 decades constituted the entire history of women's basketball's relationship with sportswear marketing. Into that world, one player arrived with enough commercial pull to change the terms. And instead of simply changing the terms for herself, which everyone would have understood and no one would have blamed her for, she changed the terms for someone else. That is the story. Not the $25 million, although the $25 million matters. Not the sold-out merchandise, although the sold-out merchandise matters. The story is that when Caitlin Clark sat across from Nike with more leverage than any woman in the history of her sport had ever possessed, she looked at the person who stood up for her when it cost everything and paid nothing, and she built a door that had never existed before and walked Sophie Cunningham through it. Professional sports is not designed to produce that moment. The incentive structures, the contractual frameworks, the agent relationships, the entire commercial architecture of the industry pushes in the opposite direction at every point. The fact that the moment happened anyway says something about the person who made it happen. And it says something else too. Something worth sitting with even after the highlight clips have been watched and the merchandise receipts have been counted and the campaigns have run their course. The biggest opportunities we ever get are usually framed as exclusively ours. We earn them, we negotiate for them, we hold on to them with both hands because everyone in the room is telling us that this is what we worked for and this is what we deserve, and there will be no more after this one. Caitlin Clark was in that room. She had the jersey in her hands and the cameras pointed at her and the contract on the table and 25 million reasons to follow every instruction she had been given. She turned away from all of it. She turned to the person standing next to her and handed her something she could never have gotten on her own. Some moments change a game. Some moments change a league. And some moments, the rare ones, the ones that get described to grandchildren, change the way the people watching them think about what it means to actually win something. That evening in Indianapolis was the third kind. If this story hit differently for you than you expected, leave a comment below telling us which part of it stayed with you. And if you want more stories about the moments in sports that nobody fully covered the first time around, subscribe, because there are a lot more of them.